Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us. While we don't have, as the chairman mentioned, the full budget request, there's certainly no shortage of things to talk about today, and I know you've been on Capitol Hill since early this morning, so I appreciate that. You certainly do have a large job as head of a massive, sprawling department. As I noted this time last year, the department's critical missions include counterterrorism, trade enforcement. You know, we only talk about certain aspects of Homeland Security sometimes, but when you see the massiveness of what you're dealing with, maritime security, opioid and drug interdiction, presidential protection, cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, emergency management, continuity of government, law enforcement training, countering weapons of mass destruction, state and local information sharing, and more, as well as this past year responding to the pandemic. On top of that, Secretary Mayorkas, despite what my esteemed chairman says, your first 100 days have been dominated by a border crisis of the administration's own making. We are currently in the midst of a historic surge at the southern border. There were 178,000 encounters in April, and tens of thousands more entered undetected. Drugs continue, this is a big issue for me. Drugs continue to pour across our border, including record amounts of fentanyl, which are devastating states like West Virginia and killing a lot of our people. Mr. Secretary, you and I traveled to the border a few months ago, and I greatly appreciated your invitation and willingness to do so. I saw all of this firsthand, and the crossings have only increased since our visit. And yet, the administration continues to insist that the border is secure. The facts on the ground that I just described apparently are not viewed as a security or law enforcement challenge, but a more logistical challenge in processing migrants who arrive with no legal claim to enter the United States. Additionally, ICE apprehensions and deportations have plummeted, and more criminal aliens are on the streets as a result. In light of these challenges, the administration's FY22 discretionary request for the department is highly concerning. Despite every other agency receiving substantial increases in funding, the Department of Homeland Security stands alone as the only department held virtually flat from last year. This is highly conspicuous thrift from an administration that has already enacted and proposed trillions in new spending. And even before we get to FY22, we need to get through this current fiscal year. In FY 2019, during a lesser surge at the border, the administration, and that was the Trump administration, made a supplemental request for funds, and Congress responded by providing an additional $1.3 billion to DHS. This year, we have received no supplemental request from the administration, despite the fact that we know the border is surging, like the one we're facing now, are placing significant unbudgeted strains on agency resources. The department does have transfer and reprogramming authorities that have been under attack in recent years, but which I have defended when they are used appropriately. So we continue to await the department's plan for financing the current surge. However, if we are facing costs comparable to FY 2019, I'm concerned that attempting to cover such costs from within the department would stretch the intended purpose of its transfer and reprogramming authorities and inevitably strain the shared priorities of Congress and the department. Finally, I must address the border wall construction pause, which violates decades of budget law precedents put forward by the GAO. Vice Chairman Shelby and I laid out in great detail the legal case against this pause. And while budget law may be arcane, the impact of this impoundment on our Border Patrol agents and our country's security, I believe, is very real. Every administration is certainly entitled to their new priorities. It is not entitled to thwart laws that were enacted in previous years on a bipartisan basis. It is not entitled to under-execute on congressionally appropriated funds in the hopes that it can eventually thwart them altogether. Despite all the noise, this committee has a history of working in a bipartisan way to further the mission of the department. When administrations include unrealistic or unjustifiable proposals, we work across the aisle to try to move forward in a reasonable way. That's what this committee does, and I'm sure that's what we'll do again this year. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary, for not just being here, but for serving. Thank you.